The death on the electric chair. Some crimes chill us because of the cruelty of the killer. But some are terrifying because of how far an entire system will go to silence the truth. In 1999, a young black man named Keith Baldwin was strapped into the electric chair in Alabama. He sat quietly, hands bound, electrodes fixed to his body. Behind the thick glass window, no family, no supporters, no one watching with tears in their eyes. Just one sentence was recorded from him before the switch was pulled. "I forgive you. But I am innocent." It wasn't a desperate plea. It wasn't the last act of a manipulative killer. It was the final breath of a man who may have been forgotten by history, but whose truth still haunts the system that killed him. Why him? Why was a teenager with no violent past, no physical evidence against him, no eyewitnesses, sentenced to death? While the man who later confessed to the murder got life in prison. Why did key evidence disappear? Why was the real killer's confession letter ignored, as if it never existed? This is not just a murder case. This is the story of a justice system that would rather kill than admit a mistake. Of a young man whose confession was beaten out of him with wires and fists. Of race, silence, and a courtroom that didn't care. And this is not just about the victim found in a ditch. This is about another victim who was strapped into the electric chair, and forgotten. This is the story of Keith Baldwin. A death sentence built from silence, racism, and the absence of truth. And if you believe in justice, you need to hear the whole story. Part 1, Escape, a fatal ride, and a story no one wanted to hear. Most tragedies don't begin with gunshots. They begin with something small, a door opening, a hesitant nod, a decision made at the wrong time. June 1977. It was a blistering summer in the American South, hot, heavy, and suffocating. The air still thick with the weight of post-war scars, civil rights promises unfulfilled, and a justice system that never quite looked the same for everyone. Two young black men, Keith Baldwin, 18, and Edward Dean Horsley, 22, had just escaped from a juvenile detention facility in North Carolina. They had no money. No family waiting. No real plan, except one. Get as far away from the system as possible. Brian, born in 1959, was a skinny, quiet teenager. Neighbors described him as polite, shy, and respectful. While he had a juvenile record for petty theft, he had never been charged with a violent crime. He was the kind of boy people thought might have turned his life around, if someone had given him the chance. Edward, on the other hand, was 4 years older. He had served time. He was impulsive, easily agitated, and, most notably, left-handed. That detail would become disturbingly important later. After escaping, the two wandered through small towns across the deep South, stealing snacks, sleeping in parks, hiding from police. Until, one fateful day, they crossed paths with a young woman who had no idea what she was about to drive into. Naomi Rolone, 16, was a white teenager from Pensacola, Florida. She had just finished visiting her grandmother in North Carolina and was driving home alone. That was unusual for a girl her age, but not unheard of. Naomi was confident, smart, and fiercely independent, according to her family. On a quiet highway in Alabama, she slowed down for two strangers on the side of the road. Brian approached her. Spoke calmly. She nodded. That was the last decision she would ever make. 3 days later, Naomi's body was found in a roadside ditch outside Monroeville, Alabama. She had been raped and stabbed 19 times, mostly in the chest and abdomen. Her clothes were torn. Her fingernails broken. The wounds suggested a brutal struggle, and a killer who was left-handed. Her car was recovered nearby. There was blood in the vehicle, but, and this is critical, no fingerprints, no hair samples, no fiber evidence, and of course, no DNA. It was 1977, before forensic DNA testing existed. The only evidence police had. Someone had seen two black men driving Naomi's car. That was enough. Brian and Edward were arrested at a cheap motel. Police burst in, guns drawn. They didn't show a warrant. They didn't allow a phone call. No one informed their families. No lawyer was present. They vanished into a black hole. For the next 72 hours, Brian was held in total isolation. No food. No sleep. No light. No attorney. Just questions. And fists. And wires. After 3 days, police announced, Brian confessed. A detailed 8-page written statement that described, in graphic terms, the rape and murder of Naomi Rolone. According to the statement, Brian was the ringleader, the one who drove, who initiated the assault, who plunged the knife. But there were problems. Big ones. The confession was handwritten. No lawyer signed off. No recording. No video. It didn't match Edward's story. It contradicted key evidence. Later, Brian would say, "They beat me with wires. They threatened to hang me. They kept me in a room without light, without sleep. Finally, they told me if I didn't write what they wanted, they'd kill me right there." He was 18 years old. Alone. Terrified. "I lied to survive," he said years later. "But they killed me anyway." What makes this more disturbing isn't just the confession. It's that every other piece of evidence either didn't exist, or pointed away from Brian. No DNA. No fingerprints. No eyewitnesses. And most critically, the stab wounds were made by someone left-handed. Brian was right-handed. Edward was not. But this didn't seem to matter. Police didn't investigate the handedness issue. They didn't check for fibers or blood typing. They didn't try to find Naomi's missing items. They had a confession, and that was enough. Here's where it becomes surreal. Edward Horsley, the left-handed man, with prior convictions, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Brian Baldwin, who claimed he was beaten into confessing, was sentenced to death. Edward was later released from prison due to health issues. Brian never got a second chance. One man confessed and lived. One man may have lied and died. And the system didn't blink. So who was the real victim? Yes, Naomi was brutally murdered. That is undeniable. But what if the state killed someone else, too? What if Brian Baldwin was a second victim, not of a knife, but of a system that needed someone to blame? 3 people got into Naomi's Chevrolet that day. One was found in a ditch. One went to prison and came home. And one sat in the electric chair, because of a confession written in darkness, with blood still on the floor. Part 2, The Bloody Confession, a Truth Never Allowed to Speak. Most confessions don't begin with guilt. They begin with fear, and end in silence. Brian Baldwin, just 18 years old, had no money, no lawyer, no family nearby, and no one to save him. After being arrested at a small motel, he was taken into a dark interrogation room, no lawyer, no food, no light, no sleep, and no one knew he was even there. 72 hours of isolation. But it wasn't just questioning. It was psychological and physical torture. According to Brian's later statements, he was beaten with wires, threatened with lynching, and forced to stand for hours. Every time he collapsed, his blood hit the cold concrete floor. And then, when his body gave out and his mind blurred from exhaustion, the officers handed him paper, a pen, and said, "Write down everything. Confess to killing Naomi Rolón." Brian refused at first. But when they brought the wires out again and said, "This time it'll be the last," he broke. The confession was supposedly detailed and graphic. 8 full pages describing how Brian raped Naomi, stabbed her 19 times, and even included how he felt afterward. But pause for a moment. Something didn't add up. Brian had limited writing ability, yet the confession flowed like someone trained. There was no audio recording. No video. No lawyer present. The statement conflicted with forensics, especially the most glaring fact. The killer was left-handed. Brian was right-handed. Forensic pathologists confirmed. The stab wounds were angled from left to right, with depth and direction consistent with a left-handed attacker. Brian was right-handed. Edward, the other escapee, was left-handed. But the police never followed up. They didn't compare blood spatter, position of wounds, or attacker angles. Why? Because they already had what Alabama's 1977 justice system needed. A black teenager. A dead white girl. And a confession. Case closed. No eyewitnesses saw Brian commit the murder. There was no DNA testing available at the time. No fingerprints. No blood linking him to the body. Not a single shred of physical proof. What did they present? A handwritten confession. Vague witness statements about 2 black men in a white girl's car. And silence, a long, heavy silence from a courtroom that refused to question the narrative. Brian's trial lasted barely a day and a half. The jury was all white. His court-appointed attorney had never handled a criminal case before. No forensic experts were brought in. No independent investigators were called. No one asked, why would an 18-year-old with no history of violence suddenly stab a stranger 19 times? The outcome was inevitable: death sentence. Later, when civil rights attorneys tried to appeal Brian's case, a flood of overlooked evidence emerged. Naomi's personal items were missing, never recovered. A blood-stained cloth was found in her car, never tested. Brian and Edward's travel logs, lost by local police. One witness even said they saw Edward, not Brian, exit Naomi's car the day she disappeared. That witness was never called to testify. Brian's case isn't just about murder. It's about a system that closed its eyes to anything that didn't fit the narrative. He spent over 20 years on death row, confined in a cell barely big enough to stretch his arms. More than 3 times, new evidence nearly saved him, but each time, appeals were denied. If we had taken a step back and investigated more thoroughly, we might not have executed an innocent man, said a retired prosecutor, years later. But by then, it was too late. A confession written in darkness killed a man. No one saw him commit the crime. No one placed him at the scene. But they saw the color of his skin, and for them, that was enough. Part 3, The Fight in the Dark, Whispers from the Edge of the Abyss. They locked me in a box. But they couldn't lock up the truth. Brian Baldwin, from Death Row, 1988. After the death sentence, Brian wasn't taken to an ordinary prison. He was dragged into the concrete tomb of Alabama's death row, a windowless 6 by 9 foot cell, lit 24/7 by a buzzing fluorescent bulb. 23 hours of silence. No books. No music. No voice except the echoes of your own heartbeat. No one to witness you slowly losing your mind, except maybe God. The scariest part isn't dying. It's dying knowing no one ever believed you. Brian wrote in a letter to a New York pastor in 1988. In 1983, 6 years into his isolation, Pastor Donald Mosley, a humanitarian worker, received a handwritten letter signed Brian Keith Baldwin. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It didn't beg for release. It simply said, "I didn't kill Naomi. No one will listen. I don't want to die as someone I'm not." Something about the letter, the desperation, the clarity, the dignity, stirred something in Mosley's conscience. That letter sparked a global campaign for truth. Mosley joined forces with civil rights attorneys and reinvestigated Brian's case. What they uncovered sent chills down every spine in the room. Crucial forensic reports were never submitted in court. The confession bore signs of coercion and scripting. A handwriting expert concluded the statement may have been written under extreme duress, not in Baldwin's natural style. A former corrections officer came forward and admitted to seeing Baldwin beaten during his interrogation. Every page of the case file reeked of manipulation, negligence, and racial bias. News of Baldwin's case spread beyond America. Human rights organizations in the UK, Germany, and Canada joined the call for justice. Even Pope John Paul II wrote a personal appeal to Alabama's governor requesting clemency. Not a single official responded. CNN, BBC, and major outlets like the New York Times ran exposés on Baldwin's case, calling it one of the most alarming modern executions of a potentially innocent black man in America. We are witnessing a legal killing, sanctioned by the state, enabled by silence. The Atlantic, 1998. The truth clawed at the system's walls, but the walls were ironclad. A last-minute appeal with new forensic evidence was submitted in 1998, denied within 6 hours. Governor Fob James of Alabama coldly stated, "We do not interfere with judicial decisions. That is the rule of law. Rule of law. Or rule of who holds power." In his final week, Brian was granted permission to write letters. He didn't write to relatives. He wrote to the public. "If I die, don't let my death disappear into silence. Don't let justice be something only for the privileged. Let my death be a torchlight, to reveal the rot hiding in the dark." His words weren't angry. They were hauntingly calm, like someone who had already accepted what the world refused to acknowledge: he was innocent, and he would still die. On June 10, 1999, Baldwin was led from his cell, dressed in white. His hands were shackled. A guard asked him, "Any last words?" Brian didn't beg. He didn't cry. He simply said, "I forgive you. I did not kill Naomi. But I know you won't believe me." At 12:03 a.m., Baldwin was strapped to the electric chair, a method already outlawed in many states due to its cruelty. When the switch was flipped, the chamber flickered in eerie darkness for seconds. No one knows what Baldwin thought in that final moment. Maybe Naomi. Maybe justice. Maybe the hope that someone, someday, would tell his story right. When a system fails and refuses to admit it, it doesn't just kill one man, it kills trust, hope, and justice itself. Brian Keith Baldwin is gone. But the truth, his truth, remains. Still waiting for someone to fully uncover it. Part 4, Echoes from Death Row, When Death Isn't the End. When someone is wrongfully killed, they don't leave the world, they stay behind, like a stain that can't be scrubbed clean. Pastor Donald Mosley, after Baldwin's execution. June 10, 1999, the day Brian Baldwin was executed, was supposed to be the end. But it was only the beginning. Within 24 hours, major global media outlets exploded with headlines. Alabama executes man who may have been innocent. But it didn't stop at, may have. As newly uncovered documents surfaced, the international legal community trembled. A United Nations torture expert deemed the confession void and in violation of basic human rights. Amnesty International declared. Brian Baldwin was executed not for a crime, but for the color of his skin. Columbia University hosted an emergency symposium titled, When Justice Kills, the Baldwin Fallout. A chilling question echoed in the auditorium. If an innocent man can be legally killed, then who is the justice system truly built to serve? No answer was needed. The question was meant to haunt. The Baldwin case peeled back a horrifying truth. The rate of wrongful death penalty convictions in the U.S. is far higher than expected. 1 in every 8 death row inmates in the U.S. since 1973 has been exonerated. The majority are black, poor, and legally underrepresented. Brian Baldwin isn't a rare name. He's a symbol of a justice system decaying from within. Years after his death, top law schools, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, began teaching the Baldwin case as a core example of legal failure. It's no longer just a legal lesson. It's a lesson in human conscience. Students learn how a conviction can be built on violence and silence, how those in power can ignore evidence, and how a man, even in death, can force a system to reckon with itself. Soon after his death, HBO released a documentary titled Dead But Not Silent. Netflix featured the podcast series, The Last Words of Brian Baldwin. A critically acclaimed New York play titled June 10 reenacted Baldwin's final 24 hours on death row, audiences left in stunned silence, many in tears. Every year on June 10, the day he died, churches and human rights organizations across America hold candlelight vigils for Brian Keith Baldwin. Not to glorify him, but to remember what went wrong. If the system can kill once, it can kill again. If you stay silent, you're an accomplice. Brian may no longer be buried in the ground, but he exists in the fear in a black man's eyes as he walks into a courtroom. The despair of an underprivileged defendant without a proper lawyer. Every rushed verdict handed down without reviewing the evidence. The truth has never been officially acknowledged. No apology sent to his family. No accountability for the false confession. No punishment for those who let an innocent man die. And that is why he still cannot rest. A system that cannot correct itself is far more dangerous than any criminal. Brian Keith Baldwin is not a relic of the past. He's a mirror of the present. And the only question that matters now is, will we finally look at that reflection, or turn away again? Part 5, The Others Who Haunt the System, When Death Becomes Policy. We didn't just kill a man. We built a machine that kills, with paperwork. Brian Stevenson, human rights lawyer. Some people still believe the death penalty is the ultimate justice. A form of punishment reserved for the worst of the worst. Irreversible. Clean. Final. But if you believe that, look again. Carlos de Luna, executed in 1989 for murder. After his death, New evidence pointed to another man with the same name as the real killer. Cameron Todd Willingham, put to death in 2004 for allegedly setting the fire that killed his 3 children. Independent arson experts later said the fire was accidental. Troy Davis, executed despite 7 of 9 eyewitnesses recanting, saying they were pressured to lie. Still, Georgia refused to stop the killing. And Brian Keith Baldwin, just one of many names on a growing list of state-sanctioned victims. Imagine this. A district attorney running for re-election. He needs to look tough on crime. Needs a headline. A trophy. A scalp. And what better way than to charge someone, anyone, and push for death? In this system, the poor, the voiceless, the marginalized are the easiest targets. No money for a good lawyer. Then prepare to meet death, in a courtroom. The victim's family is often led to believe justice has been served. Until one day, they find out, they cheered for the wrong death. The inmate's family lives in a permanent nightmare. I watched the state murder my brother, and I couldn't stop it. The lawyers, guards, chaplains, all who witnessed the death of an innocent. They don't sleep well ever again. One prison guard whispered. It felt like murder. I was the executioner, in a uniform. After Baldwin's death, poor southern communities began to go silent. They stopped cooperating with police. They refused to testify in court. They no longer believed in the system. Why? Because they knew. This courtroom doesn't protect us. It just needs someone to blame. Baldwin's death didn't just kill a man. It killed trust in the very idea of justice. Every time a wrongful execution is exposed, people ask. Why not overturn the case? Reinvestigate? Apologize? The real answer. Because if they admit they were wrong even once, the entire machine risks collapse. So instead, they choose to burn the files, deny access, refuse compensation, call it a procedural hiccup, a life reduced to a technical error. The most terrifying thing about capital punishment isn't just that it kills. It's that it kills any chance of redemption. You can free a man from prison if new evidence emerges. But you can't exhume and revive someone who was already executed. And that's why the death penalty is a legal form of murder. Sanitized, politically convenient, irreversible, and wrong. The silence that follows the death of the innocent, that's the scariest part. Because it guarantees more deaths will come. Brian Baldwin didn't die once. He dies again every time another innocent is led to the execution chamber. He dies in every moment a flawed system refuses to change. Conclusion: when America looks into a broken mirror. In the 1970s and 80s, America was a land of dreams laced with nightmares. On the surface, glamorous, powerful, the so-called land of the free. But underneath, rampant racism, systemic injustice, and a judicial system steeped in politics. The federal government launched a war on crime that stirred fear across the country. Local officials, desperate to appear tough, competed to demand death sentences like trophies. And who became the easiest targets? Black men. The poor. The defenseless. The voiceless. Brian Keith Baldwin was the perfect profile for execution. A young black man. No money for a real defense. Arrested in the deeply segregated South. Completely isolated. He didn't stand a chance. The American justice system, at least back then, didn't seem designed to find truth. It existed to protect itself. When someone is coerced into confessing, tried and convicted in a single day. When evidence is ignored and witnesses are never heard. When truth becomes inconvenient. Then justice is no longer something to trust, it's a weapon used to silence and punish the disposable. Baldwin's death didn't end in the execution chamber. It seeped into legal textbooks. Into graduation speeches at law schools. Into hushed conversations behind courtroom doors. Into every new debate about the death penalty. It became a ghost that haunts the system. Forever reminding the living of a life they didn't save in time. His name still echoes through law offices, whispered with dread. That case, that was the one that changed how I see everything. And in that way, Brian Baldwin's death didn't silence him. It made him eternal. America, then and perhaps now, loves to wave banners of freedom. To deliver soaring speeches about justice. To quote the Constitution in courtrooms and campaign rallies. But when a man can be sentenced to death without proper counsel. When obvious misconduct is swept under procedural errors. When an innocent man's death is reduced to a forgotten footnote. Then the democracy they preach is no more than a painted shell over a rotting core. The final question. If the system could execute someone like Brian Keith Baldwin without anyone stopping it, then how many others have died the same way, without us ever knowing their names?